January 17th, 1940. Dawn spreads a thin, pale light over a cold Pacific runway. The air smells of oil and salt. Engines cough into life, their propellers cutting the mist into ribbons. Boots scrape on concrete. Somewhere beyond the fog, gulls cry, their voices swallowed by the rising roar of aircraft. It is a moment that feels routine to the men on the tarmac. Another launch, another patrol, another promise of control over a vast ocean sky. Yet in the quiet seconds before takeoff, there is a sense of waiting, as if the sky itself is holding its breath. This moment matters because the sky, more than any battlefield, would become the true arena of the Pacific War. Control of the air meant control of the sea lanes, the islands, the supply lines, and ultimately the fate of nations. For Imperial Japan, air power was not merely a tool of war. It was a symbol of technological pride, discipline, and destiny. Japanese commanders had entered the conflict with confidence shaped by years of victories in China and by the early shock their forces delivered across the Pacific. Their fighters, agile and feared, had ruled the early skies. The men who planned those operations believed that air superiority was not just achievable, it was assured. What they expected was dominance. Japanese fighters sweeping the sky clean, striking first, striking hard, and returning unchallenged. What they experienced instead was a slow, unsettling disappearance. Aircraft that once returned in formation began to fail to come back at all. Radios went silent. Runways waited for planes that never appeared. Squadrons shrank not in a single dramatic day, but in a steady erosion that commanders struggled to explain. The sky, once a realm of certainty, became a place of unanswered questions. In the early months of the Pacific War, Japanese pilots flew some of the most respected aircraft in the world. The Mitsubishi A6M0, introduced in 1940, was light, long-ranged, and extraordinarily maneuverable. Allied pilots who first encountered it in combat were stunned by its performance. Early U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces reports described the Zero's ability to outturn and outclimb many American fighters. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive tactics, close-in dogfighting, and pilot skill. Their training pipeline, before the war, produced a relatively small but exceptionally experienced cadre of aviators. These men had logged hundreds of hours and had fought in China. They believed, with reason, that they were the elite of the skies. The expectation was clear. Japan's pilots would strike, dominate, and return. The reality, by 1942 and 1943, was different. American industry, training, and tactics began to transform the balance of power. New aircraft arrived in numbers that Japanese intelligence struggled to comprehend. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, the Vought F-4U Corsair, and improved versions of the P-38 Lightning and P-51 Mustang did not merely match the Zero. They outlasted it, outgunned it, and outnumbered it. The sky became crowded with American planes, flown by a growing pool of pilots trained in a system designed for mass production of skill. Historical records show the shift in stark terms. U.S. Navy and Marine Corps after-action reports from 1943 and 1944 document kill ratios that increasingly favored American pilots. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, later known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, stands as one of the most dramatic examples. Japanese carrier air groups suffered devastating losses, with hundreds of aircraft destroyed in a matter of days. American losses were comparatively light. Japanese commanders had expected to meet the U.S. fleet with a decisive, skilled air arm. Instead, They watched as their planes were intercepted, shot down, or forced to ditch before reaching their targets. What made this loss so shocking was not just the numbers, it was the meaning behind them. Japanese aviation doctrine had relied on quality over quantity. Their pilot training was long and demanding, producing aces whose names were known within the service. But that system could not quickly replace losses. The United States, by contrast, had built a training and production machine that could replace pilots and aircraft at a pace that redefined modern warfare. By 1943, the U.S. was producing tens of thousands of aircraft annually. Training fields across the American interior sent waves of new pilots to the front. The sky over the Pacific became, in effect, an extension of American factories and classrooms. Commanders in Japan began to receive reports that were difficult to reconcile with their expectations. Squadrons reported meeting formations of American aircraft larger than any they had previously encountered. Pilots spoke of enemy planes that could absorb damage and keep flying, of armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks that reduced the chance of catastrophic loss. The Zero, for all its agility, lacked such protection. Its pilots flew with skill and courage, but their aircraft offered little margin for error. The emotional contrast was sharp. The confidence of early victories gave way to a growing awareness that the balance had shifted. One recurring sound became a symbol of this change: the deep, steady hum of American engines arriving in waves. To Japanese observers, that sound represented something more than aircraft. It represented industrial power, a nation capable of producing not just planes, but the fuel, spare parts, and trained crews to keep them in the air. In Japanese wartime diaries and post-war memoirs, pilots and commanders alike described the psychological weight of seeing American formations that seemed endless. The sky no longer felt like a domain to be mastered. It felt like a tide that could not be stopped. Factual records support this perception. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had introduced the Fast Carrier Task Force, capable of launching massive airstrikes while defending itself with layered air patrols. Radar-guided intercepts allowed American fighters to meet Japanese raids before they reached the fleet. The combination of technology, training, and numbers created a system in which Japanese planes were often detected, intercepted, and destroyed before they could even see their targets. The disappearance of fighters was not mysterious. It was systematic. Yet for those on the Japanese side, it felt mysterious. A squadron would launch with a certain number of aircraft. Only a fraction would return. The reasons were known in theory: enemy fighters, anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failures. But the cumulative effect was disorienting. The sky became a ledger of losses, each missing plane a name, a face, a story that ended somewhere between clouds and sea. Transformation came not only in tactics, but in ideology. Early in the war, Japanese air power had been seen as a symbol of national pride and technological excellence. As losses mounted, that symbol began to crack. Commanders faced a painful truth: the system that had produced elite pilots could not sustain a long industrial war. The United States had turned the sky into a factory output, where quantity and reliability combined with improving quality. The Japanese aviation arm, once a spearhead, became a thinning line. Historical documents from late 1944 and 1945 reveal a shift in Japanese strategy. With trained pilots increasingly scarce, the emphasis moved toward desperate measures. Aircraft that might once have been part of a coordinated strike were now used in missions that reflected the shrinking options available. This was not a choice made lightly. It was the product of a long process in which the disappearance of fighters forced commanders to confront the limits of their system. The recurring symbol of American abundance appears not only in aircraft, but in something as simple as fuel. American carriers could sustain long operations because fuel and supplies flowed steadily across the Pacific. Tankers, supply ships, and forward bases created a network that kept planes flying day after day. Japanese forces, facing shortages, often had to ration flight hours. Pilots trained less. Aircraft flew fewer missions. The sky, once a place of opportunity, became a place of constraint. In post-war interviews, some Japanese officers spoke of the moment they realized the air war was lost. It was not always a single battle. Sometimes it was the simple fact that their airfields were quiet. The sound of engines, once constant, became intermittent. Planes were grounded for lack of parts or fuel. When American aircraft appeared overhead, they often came unchallenged. The disappearance was not only of fighters, but of the confidence that had once filled the hangars. The emotional weight of this transformation is difficult to overstate. For pilots trained to see themselves as the vanguard of a rising empire, the realization that the sky now belonged to someone else was deeply unsettling. The sky, which had once been a place of freedom and mastery, became a reminder of limitation. Each missing aircraft was a measure of how far the war had turned. The American system, by contrast, continued to expand. New pilots arrived, often younger, trained in standardized programs that emphasized teamwork, gunnery, and survivability. Their aircraft were designed not only to fight, but to bring pilots home. Armor, redundancy, and rescue systems reflected a different philosophy, one that valued the preservation of personnel as a strategic asset. The sky filled with aircraft that could take damage and still land. For Japanese commanders watching from the ground or reading reports, this was a profound contrast. Their own planes, light and agile, had been optimized for performance, not protection. The difference now mattered. The sound of American engines, returning again and again, became a kind of metronome of defeat. It marked time not in minutes, but in months of steady pressure. Each new wave of aircraft represented factories working around the clock, workers assembling engines, mechanics training on new systems, and supply chains stretching across oceans. The sky became a reflection of a broader reality, a nation mobilized at scale. By 1945, the disappearance of Japanese fighters from many skies was no longer a temporary condition. It was a defining feature of the war's final phase. American aircraft roamed with increasing freedom. Air superiority allowed for sustained bombing campaigns and the isolation of Japanese-held islands. For commanders who had once planned bold aerial offensives, the quiet of their runways was a stark reminder of how the balance had shifted. This transformation also reshaped how the war was understood within Japan. The early narrative of unstoppable air power gave way to a more somber recognition of limits. The ideology that had celebrated elite skill now confronted the reality of industrial scale. The sky had become a mirror, reflecting not only aircraft, but the systems behind them. The recurring symbol, the steady hum of American aircraft, stands in for something larger. It represents abundance, not only of machines, but of resources, training, and logistical depth. It represents a form of democracy in motion, where factories, workers, and pilots were part of a shared effort. The sound carried across the Pacific was not just mechanical, it was political and economic. It was the sound of a system that could sustain pressure over time. In the epilogue of this story, the vanished fighters are more than a military statistic. They are a reminder of how wars are decided not only by courage and skill, but by systems and capacity. The sky, once ruled by a handful of elite pilots, became a domain shaped by mass participation and industrial strength. The disappearance was not sudden, but it was decisive. The larger truth is that freedom and abundance, when organized and sustained, can reshape even the most contested spaces. The Pacific sky, once a place of fierce uncertainty, became a testament to what a nation could achieve when it aligned its people, its industry, and its ideals toward a common purpose. The steady hum of returning aircraft became a promise that the sky would no longer be a place of vanishing, but a place of return. And so, in the quiet after the engines fade, the lesson remains. The sky remembers every plane that did not come back. It also remembers the forces that filled it again and again. In that contrast lies the enduring story of a war fought not only in the clouds, but in factories, classrooms, and supply lines stretching across an ocean. The vanished fighters mark the end of one era of air power. The returning waves mark the beginning of another, where abundance and freedom reshaped the very sound of the sky.